We have two main historical writers, Suetonius and Tacitus, and they both wrote in the 1st century AD about the Caesars who had ruled from the time of Augustus on, so the whole of the so-called Julio-Claudian Dynasty, Augustus then being taken over by Tiberius, then Caligula, Claudius, Nero. Clearly it's good to have more than one source, because then you can compare one against the other and try to make some kind of historical judgments. But of course that also means that there's a lack of a direct contemporary historian. What we have, interestingly, is a very famous inscription which embodies the words of Augustus himself. In Latin it's called the Res Gestae, which informally could be translated as things that I did, or my achievements by the emperor himself. And he instructed that these Res Gestae should be inscribed on stone, and we think also on paper, and distributed around the empire at his death. So the Res Gestae themselves, there's a paragraph at the end of which he says, you know, I wrote this in my 76th year, which is the year that actually he died. He died maybe a few months after that. So this was a kind of final will and testimony to Augustus's rule. And in it he tells us which honours he'd received and which ones he'd turned down, how much money he'd spent on individuals and on buildings and on temples and all that sort of thing. So he was keen to show that he'd been a very generous emperor. And then also finally he talked about his foreign policy, the alliances he'd made, the countries he'd conquered. So it was as if to say, this sums up my rule. And it's quite dry in tone. It just says I did this and I did that. I mean, that's the only thing that stops it from being dry, that it's in the first person. And luckily, one of these inscriptions survived almost intact on a wall in Turkey, discovered in the 16th century and worked upon, and people took all sorts of copies of it and that sort of thing. And so we can still read it today. And it's a very important contemporary document. Though, of course, it's propaganda. It's what Augustus wanted us to know about his rule. So some of the things that we learn from Tacitus and Suetonius, the two main historians of the following century, the 1st century AD, certainly paints a slightly different picture. But there's one other element of it, well, there are several other bits of evidence, but one that I deal with particularly in my teaching and research is the literary heritage of the age of Augustus. So there were some of the greatest poets that ever lived during that period. Virgil, who wrote the Aeneid, Horace, who wrote a wonderful series of odes and other poetry, and Propertius, who wrote love poetry. And these are all poets of the Augustan age. Ovid then, who wrote love poetry, lighter love poetry. And interpreting that literature in the light of what we know of the politics of the age is also a fascinating exercise.